Okay, hello everyone. I'm just going to give you a walkthrough of an essay question that I've set in class. The question is, evaluate the view that globalization has led to soft power becoming more significant than hard power in addressing global challenges. So we have to break this question down. Always a good idea to plan for 5 minutes first and think to yourself, how are we going to answer this question? So this is a question about hard and soft power, and it's also a question about considering the impact that globalization has had on hard and soft power. Because it asks about two different elements, it is asking about soft and hard power. You can see the guidance there says when a question asks you to compare two elements, in this case, soft power and hard power, be sure to include both in each paragraph. So in the three paragraphs that come after the introduction and before the conclusion, those three middle paragraphs, you've got to have hard and soft power. And within them, doing comparative analysis. I don't really want to see half an essay that looks at soft power and then half an essay that looks at hard power. We've gone through this a few different times with different questions. If there's two elements in the question it's asking you to compare, please include both of them within each of those middle paragraphs. You can't make reasoned judgments unless you compare one directly against the other. Global challenges. Well, there are four main global challenges that the exam board Edexcel address: security or conflict, poverty, inequality, environment, and human rights. They are the four global challenges. So we have four potential paragraphs that we can write here. Probably only going to write three because we've only got 45 minutes, but we've got four good paragraphs there. So pick three that you like, and you can compare the use of soft power and hard power against three of those four global challenges and determine whether soft or hard power is more effective, more significant, better at addressing those things. The globalization aspect is really just to recognize that, look, the world has become increasingly interconnected, increasingly interdependent, and has the nature of interdependence, has the nature of globalization made it so that actually soft powers become more important than hard. The introduction, as always, please make a judgment. Please make a judgment in the introduction, answer the question. For me, there's kind of two ways you can go here. You can agree with the premise of the question that yes, globalization has made soft power more important than hard power in meeting global challenges. The opposite argument, I wouldn't necessarily say no, soft power has not become significant. The counter argument would be for me that yes, soft power is important in dealing with global challenges, but we can't overlook the impact of hard power either. So for me, that's the two choices we have. Agree with the premise of the question, or disagree by saying, yes, soft power is important, but we also can't overlook the impact of hard power. And there's evidence to support that view as well. So that's going to be the judgment, either of those two things, and outline a few reasons why. The reasons why will become the things that you address in those middle paragraphs. And you can see there where it says middle paragraphs, I really, really, really need you to be comparing soft and hard power within each of the middle paragraphs in relation to meeting those global challenges. It really is the only way. I cannot be clearer about that. It really is the only way. And a conclusion will reiterate judgments that you've made throughout your essay. The bottom bullet point there says you may also indicate which factors are most significant. I think sometimes students don't like a conclusion that just reiterates judgments they've made throughout the essay. Well, what you can do here is you can say, well, I don't know, that overall soft power has become more significant because it's better at dealing with conflict, it's better at addressing human rights issues, but it's especially good in dealing with environmental issues, and hard power doesn't really have an answer to that. That way, you're kind of inferring that there's some reasons why soft power is more important, but a big one is the environment, and of course, environmental concerns, one of the biggest issues of the 21st century. You can do a similar kind of judgment if you say if you side with hard power. You can say overall, the impact of hard power can't be overlooked, especially when it comes to issues of global security, which again is one of the big pressing issues of our time. So to reiterate, introduction, make a judgment, outline some reasons why. Middle paragraphs, each paragraph will look at a different global issue. You'll look at hard and soft power within each. Conclusion, reiterate those judgments. And if you want to give your conclusion a little bit of extra spice, make it a little bit different from those interim judgments that you've made throughout your essay, you can indicate that, you know, soft or hard power is particularly good at addressing certain global challenges. I've covered this already, but overall, the direction of the essay will either say, well, look, soft power is becoming increasingly important because globalization leads to the need for increased cooperation and interdependence. Globalization incentivizes this kind of rules-based international order. You can link in concepts like, for example, Cohen's cobweb model. And in a world that is kind of described as being like a cobweb model, soft power is going to be more effective. The cobweb is naturally going to be quite delicate and quite intertwined. Hard power can be too destructive in that context, and soft power, the power of persuasion and through cooperation and interdependence and everything, can be more effective in the context of that cobweb. The other argument for hard power will recognize that actually sometimes the persuasion of soft power is not so persuasive. In some contexts, it can be ineffective. And at times, maybe coercion is needed. Coercion might be needed to get actors to do things that they don't want to do. And if actors are stubborn and they don't wish to be influenced by soft power, then maybe the influence of soft power is overstated, and old-fashioned force might sometimes be the only way. I think either of those arguments are fine. I don't really have an issue with people taking one side or the other here. The only thing I would say, and I've said already, is don't dismiss soft power entirely. If you side with hard power, still recognize that in some contexts, soft power can be effective, just not all the time. Right, so here we've got some arguments in green and red for each of the global challenges. So, for example, on the soft power and security box, we've got ways in which soft power can be effective in dealing with security and conflict issues. And then in red, we've got ways in which at times it's not quite as effective. Likewise with hard power. So I'm sure at this point you might want to pause the video, but I'll just talk you through quickly a few ideas. With conflicts, the kind of the soft power argument is going to link in with this, the concept of liberal institutionalism. Institutions are really good at promoting a rules-based international order. Institutions like, for example, the UN can promote the idea of kind of shared values, universalism, and kind of expected behaviors and norms that contribute to a more secure order. The counter argument to that, in red, you can see it says the impact of this can be quite slow and ineffective against those who don't share these values. Soft power can be quite persuasive when states see the benefit of cooperation, but often, especially in terms of conflict and security, national interest is a really significant, driver for determining how states behave. And if they don't accept the values of the liberal international order, then soft power is not so persuasive. On the hard power side, we can say, look, military power has at times been really effective, especially in the short term. Hard power has been used, for example, to stop a genocide in Bosnia after the Srebrenica massacre, brought an end to the Kosovo war, and brought Kosovo under UN control. Military intervention in Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, successful in helping transition the Ivory Coast towards a more democratic system. Military intervention was useful in Sierra Leone to help enforce a peace agreement there. There are countless examples of times where military intervention has brought an end to a conflict, saved lives, stopped genocide or other kind of abuses, and especially in the short term can be quite effective. Sanctions too. Remember, sanctions are hard power. Sanctions can have a more long-term impact compared to the short-term impact of direct military intervention. The counter argument to this, of course, is that we're focusing here on security, and military intervention can destabilize regions. Arguably, the NATO intervention in Libya destabilized the region. Military intervention in Afghanistan have done a similar thing. In a counter argument to sanctions, we can say, well, sanctions are only really effective when they're coordinated. And in a world that's increasingly multipolar, the impacts of sanctions aren't quite as effective as they used to be. And we can see this with Russia. Western sanctions against Russia have hurt the Russian economy, but Russia continue to have lots of markets, especially the BRICS countries, that they can trade with. And Russia have shown that they're still able to sell gas and oil to the likes of India and China. And that has made the sanctions against them slightly less effective. Moving on to poverty and inequality, you can make quite straightforward liberal arguments in favour of soft power here, that free trade, economic interdependence leads to prosperity. Soft power plays a role here because through trade agreements, more kind of powerful actors, like for example, the EU are particularly good at this. They can encourage development and growth by trying to get states to sign trade agreements with them. From their perspective, these trade agreements would be mutually beneficial. The Marxist arguments in red are the arguments that you would have heard in class, that maybe free trade doesn't necessarily create prosperity for all. The issue with free trade is it entrenches inequality. It's a form of exploitation. You can make those kind of race to the bottom arguments as well. Moving on to the hard power, sometimes regime change and those kind of the force used in military intervention can impoverish countries. Sanctions in particular are quite ineffective in dealing with poverty. Venezuela is a very good example of this, where the United States and others have imposed sanctions on Venezuela because a corrupt government is, entrenching poverty in the country. But what the sanctions have done is made the situation worse, led to hyperinflation, food shortages, a huge refugee crisis of about 7 million Venezuelans try and cross the border in search for food. And so hard power in dealing with poverty and inequality can exacerbate a situation by creating more instability. And we can make a link there between political instability and poverty and inequality. Okay, moving on to the environment. The soft power arguments for the environment is that this is truly an example of a global challenge where states need to work together, and through things like, for example, the COP meetings that take place every year, through the UNFCCC, states can work together, cooperate, and try to address challenges. By finding kind of common understanding, mutually beneficial outcomes. The counter argument to that is that it's quite ineffective at times. And, the Paris Agreement, in one sense, was a triumph, but in another sense, we can criticize the Paris Agreement for not going far enough. The targets within the Paris Agreement are not being met. The target, of course, is that global temperatures should not increase by more than 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. Within the Paris Agreement, there is a clause about 1.5 degrees being the preferred target. In 2024, global temperatures increased by 1.5 degrees already. And so we are well on our way to not meeting the Paris Agreement. The problem with Paris, of course, is that it's not very well enforced. And that is a broader problem with soft power, that the enforceability of cooperation through soft power is quite limited. And it does mean that often states are able to prioritize their national interest at the expense of the greater good. The hard power options in dealing with the environment are mostly theoretical. It's not realistic to think about intervention on environmental grounds. It has been discussed in a theoretical sense, a form of kind of R2P, responsibility to protect, on environmental grounds rather than explicitly human rights grounds. Sanctions can be imposed on states that do not meet their environmental commitments. This may be something that has to be considered in the future, especially if states don't meet their commitments without that extra coercion. A big problem here is, of course, that some of the worst offenders, the United States, China, India, are powerful countries. I mean, India is becoming increasingly powerful, and so the likelihood that hard power sanctions or whatever else would be effective is quite limited by the fact that those who are committing the most kind of egregious environmental violations are also the most powerful. Onto human rights. The same arguments really about liberalism, promoting an international order based on shared values and norms, the promotion of international law. You can refer to Kant's triangle. Those 3 elements that contribute towards peace. What are they? Interdependence and democracy and international organization. All of those things contribute towards peace. And the counter argument, the realist arguments, if the liberal arguments are the arguments in favor of cooperation to human rights, the counter arguments are the realist ones. International anarchy makes cooperation difficult to enforce. Institutions, the international courts and so on, are retrospective by definition, and the extent to which they are a deterrent to human rights abuses is hard to prove because it's a counterfactual. How many human rights abuses didn't take place because of the existence of these human rights institutions? It's impossible to say. Probably when it comes to human rights issues, hard power, we could say, is perhaps especially effective. Again, especially in the short term. Direct military intervention can stop serious atrocities, and when it's effective, it tends to have an immediate impact. We can point to, though, in the red, the inconsistent application of things like R2P. In class, we looked at the global r2p.org website, and on there it makes the case that while R2P is being enforced on limited occasions, there are a whole list of conflicts around the world where human rights violations are taking place, where there has not been significant intervention on the grounds of R2P. Myanmar is a good example. In Myanmar, the Burmese people have held up signs asking for R2P. We want R2P ASAP. But I mean, there's too many examples to list. Sudan, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Ukraine, Gaza, recent wars in Yemen, Syria, and so on. Just couldn't think of any more. Okay. In terms of how you write these paragraphs, we've talked in class about signposting. When addressing a weaker side of the argument, it's a good idea to indicate to the examiner that this is your weaker side. And you can do that by through the language that you use. You could also, in your analysis, really kind of go into the weaknesses in one side of the argument. So let's just go through this slide. It says, in your comparative analysis of the competing perspectives, it is a good idea to signpost the direction that your argument is going to take. This means prefixing your weaker argument with an indication that it is the weaker argument. And for clarity and time constraints, I would say that you should also consider the weaknesses in your weaker argument in the analysis, but I wouldn't necessarily look at the weaknesses of your strong argument, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to avoid a situation where we provide an argument and a counter argument and present them as equal. We want to present an argument and a counter argument, but through the analysis, start showing that there are significant limitations to one side. So then when it comes to the evaluation becomes logical and reasonable based on the analysis that we've already done. So, for example, if we're going to look at the global challenge of security, let's say, for example, we're going to argue in favor of soft power. We're going to argue in favor of soft power in our essay. And so in the paragraph about security, we're going to side with soft power. We might look to integrate some of the red arguments from the hard power side into the analysis when considering the merits of hard power. So we might begin a paragraph by saying, although hard power is effective sometimes in dealing with security concerns, military intervention can sometimes have the opposite effect and destabilize a region that the intervention is trying to secure. We are signposting there by saying sometimes hard power is effective. The inference we can make is sometimes it isn't. When analysing the impacts of hard power, of military intervention, of sanctions in the interest of security, our analysis might recognise that sanctions only work when they're coordinated, and multipolarity makes the coordination less likely. We can indicate that military intervention is effective sometimes, but not always. We can talk about how military intervention in Afghanistan destabilized Afghanistan. We can talk about how military intervention in Libya destabilized Libya. Then we can bring in our however. However, soft power is more consistent in dealing with security concerns through institutions and the promotion of values and ideas and international law. Through these institutions, we get a far more consistent a more consistent effect of trying to protect global security and trying to bring an end to conflict. And again, of course, the opposite can be true. If we're going to make the point that actually soft power is quite ineffective in dealing with security, we will start to acknowledge some of the red arguments on the soft power side. But when considering hard power, we don't really want to give too much attention to the red arguments on the hard power side, because otherwise what we end up doing is we end up just presenting two arguments that seem quite equal in weight. And we want to show that one argument is stronger than the other. Bottom bullet point says this will help support the evaluation at the end of the paragraph, as the judgment will seem logical and clear. Finally, the evaluation. Mostly, the evaluation will just be reiterating the judgments that you've made throughout your essay in those middle paragraphs. Which argument is more convincing and why? You will already have started to do this. It's always a bad essay when you don't know what the judgment is going to be in the conclusion. I should already know. If you want, and this is what the second bullet point says, it says to avoid simply repeating the judgments that you have already made within each of the middle paragraphs, you can rank the factors. You can say, for example, hard power remains significant, especially when dealing with human rights issues and security concerns. Or you can say, overall, soft power has become increasingly important, especially in addressing issues of poverty and in the promotion of cooperation with regards to environmental issues. So you can kind of show, look, overall, one is better than the other, especially in dealing with these things, and these things really matter. And because all of the global issues matter, you'll be able to argue that these are the ones that they're particularly effective at, and that's of great significance. That's it. If you've got any questions about any of this, you know where to find me. But hopefully that will give you an idea. You'll have done this at home, and it will give you an idea if you're on the right track. There's many arguments you can make. I hope you understand that the arguments I've given you on the table are not the only ones, but it'll just give you an idea of the sorts of things you can say, the direction that the essay will take, and how you can try to acknowledge the limitations in the weaker argument as you do that comparative analysis. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. I hope you found that useful.